Good afternoon, just barely afternoon. Welcome to Mary Eberstadt's webinar, Why God? New Ideas for Nuns to Consider. I'm Doug Monroe, the Executive Director of Praxis Circle, and I want to thank all of you for giving us your precious time today on Halloween. I won't say boo, but I just did. Also, I want to thank our terrific co-sponsors, IFWE, the Institute of Faith Works and Economics, and CIC, the Catholic Information Center. I absolutely love it when Christians and others work together on important worldview issues. Praxis Circle is about exploring all major worldviews and doing so via Judeo-Christian worldview, the foundation of Western Civ. This webinar is part of a series we're building on the pillars of worldview, God being the key pillar. In the process, our mission is to help renew a free and good society. We are absolutely devoted to Mary Eberstadt, who's been a Praxis Circle contributor for, hard to believe, 8 years. She is amazing. Often referred to as among the most perceptive of today's Catholic commentators on faith, modern life, and family. Given a Catholic Church of well over 1 billion souls, by far the world's largest religion, that's quite a compliment. After the webinar, please see Mary's personal page and 2 interviews on our website among the 40 or so other Praxis Circle contributors. That number is rapidly growing. Now I'd like to turn things over to Mason New, who will manage the webinar and introduce Mary. Thanks, Mason.
Thank you, Doug. My name is Mason New, and I serve as the Education Director for Praxis Circle. Thank you all for being here today. A little bit about the format. After I introduce our guests, Mary will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes on the topic, Why God? New Ideas for Nuns to Consider. Then we will have a question and answer period, which I will moderate. So please submit your questions in the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar. I will do my best to get to as many questions as possible. After we conclude, we'll ask for feedback in a very brief survey. Finally, at the conclusion of today's webinar, please visit our website, www.praxiscircle.com, where you can find 2 full interviews, video interviews with Mary. We also have a podcast with her where she goes into multiple topics of interest. The podcast is called Building Worldviews, and you can find it anywhere you get your podcasts or on our website at praxiscircle.com. Today's Praxis Circle webinar, we meet with author Mary Eberstadt. She holds the Panula Chair in Christian Culture at Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C., and is a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute. She's an American writer whose contributions to the intellectual landscape traverse genres. An essayist, novelist, and frequent public speaker, she is the author of several books, including How the West Really Lost God, A New Theory of Secularization, Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution, and Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. Her social commentary draws from fields including anthropology, intellectual history, philosophy, popular culture, sociology, and theology. Furthermore, Mary's contributions to journalism range from short essays and reviews in mainstream venues like the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine, to longer pieces in journals of ideas such as First Things and National Affairs. She has served on the editorial staffs of 3 magazines, for which she has also written The Public Interest, The National Interest, and Policy Review. It is our distinct pleasure to welcome one of Praxis Circle's contributors, Mary Eberstadt.
Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Doug and Praxis Circle, and thank you all for joining today. It's really an honor to be here and to consider together some, I hope, important subjects. I'd like to open by quoting something from the Templeton Prize lecture by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He said, quote, "If I were called upon to identify briefly the principal trait of the entire 20th century, here too I would be unable to find anything more precise and pithy than to repeat once again, men have forgotten God." We'll return to that point. As most people know, the rise of the so-called nuns, or those who check none of the above when asked for their religious affiliation, is among the most dramatic social indicators of our time. According to Pew Research, in 1996, the share of unaffiliated Americans was 12%, and 2 years later, it was 14%. This growth has continued, and 29% of all Americans now tell the General Social Survey that they have no religion. 29%, that's almost a third of all Americans. And the young, as everyone also knows, are secularizing faster than anyone else. And yet, to focus on the young alone, as most observers do, is to miss something. The trend toward secularization was proceeding well before they were born. It was in the 1960s, not the 2020s, that Americans began their retreat from houses of worship. God is Dead, the most famous Time magazine cover in its history, was not the title of a survey in 2023. It dates all the way back to 1966. My book, How the West Really Lost God, is an attempt to explain the rapid secularization underway since the 1960s. And as it shows, I hope, there are deep reasons for the fall off in practice and belief since the sexual revolution began in the early 1960s. But today we aren't here to discuss that thesis, but something else. If people are reachable with arguments, as many people are, what kinds of arguments for faith might be made to Gen Z and other nuns? First, a few more facts to show why we're talking about this. Millennials and Zoomers, as the instruments of social science show, are the most irreligious Americans since experts began measuring such things. Even by 2019, 44% of young people aged 18 to 29 were a-religious. And none of the above is now the fastest growing religious affiliation in the United States. Again, though many older Americans profess to be shocked by such numbers, we really shouldn't be. Secularization, as mentioned, began in earnest several decades ago. Now, in addition to declining religiosity, Zoomers and millennials are distinct for other reasons. They marry later, if they marry at all. They profess even less interest in having children than the generations before them. And their love of country also appears to be at an all-time low. As one headline summarized the picture, patriotism, religion, and kids, lower priorities for younger Americans. Now, many people today, faced with these facts, complain about the young, worry about the young, even despair about the young. In what follows, I would like to do something different. Talk to them through those of you listening. I'd like to suggest 4 arguments for religious faith that might be sounded in trying to reach some of those nuns. After all, although we're not used to thinking of it this way, each of us has a choice to make. Yes, the decline of organized religion in the graying cultures of Western Europe and parts of North America is an epic story, but it is not the only story about religion today. During these same years of sluggish religious loss in the West, for example, Christianity has exploded across sub-Saharan Africa. And even within the secularizing nations, decline has been accompanied, somewhat paradoxically, by a countercultural strengthening of religious orthodoxy in some places, and a proliferation of new institutions seeking to keep the faithful in community. These facts point to two underattended truths of history. One, religious revivals never arrive on anyone's schedule. And two, they do arrive, including after periods of marked decline. In other words, today's situation isn't hopeless, and it isn't set in stone. Following are 4 arguments for why today's young people might think about breaking with today's secularism. 4 reasons to think about something that strikes many people today as radical, namely giving organized religion a shot. The first argument has to do with that opening quotation by Solzhenitsyn. We cannot understand the history of the 20th century without understanding what happened when people deliberately chose to live without faith. And we must understand the history of the 20th century. We must, to inoculate ourselves against the dangerous Rousseauian idea that people are endlessly malleable and intrinsically good. The 20th century implores us to grasp just how evil humanity can be and under what preconditions. In the monument to inhumanity, known as Auschwitz, for example, there's a pile of ashes made from incinerated bodies so large that it remains visible over 70 years later. I have seen it. Why? The greatest atrocities in the history of mankind occurred during the 20th century. The Holocaust, Mao's Great Leap Forward, the forced famine in the Ukraine, the Gulag Archipelago, the Khmer Rouge, and more. Why? Solzhenitsyn, one of the most profound thinkers in any age, argued that the common denominator of this kind of industrial slaughter was atheism. And he was not alone. History shows that the atheism of leading 19th century European intellectuals gave rise to ideologies untethered to any ethical system. These ideologies then went on to countenance slaughter on a scale never seen before. Nazis and communists may have hated each other. Historically, they did. But the carnage committed in their names was unthinkable in both cases without its precondition, atheism. There's an author named David Berlinski, who's himself an agnostic. But in a book called The Devil's Delusion, he put this point brilliantly, and I'm going to quote him here. Berlinski said, "What Hitler did not believe, and what Stalin did not believe, and what Mao did not believe, and what the SS did not believe, and what the Gestapo did not believe, and what the NKVD did not believe, and what the commissars, functionaries, swaggering executioners, Nazi doctors, Communist Party theoreticians, intellectuals, brown shirts, black shirts, Gauleiters did not believe was that God was watching what they were doing." So that historical conjunction of totalitarianism and atheism puts a choice before today's people, including today's young people. The choice can be phrased as a question. Was Solzhenitsyn right, or was he not? The mighty Russian's argument can't be refuted by kicking a stone. And if we conclude alongside Solzhenitsyn that the flight from God was instrumental to industrialized murder on a scale never seen before in place after place, well, then it just might be worth thinking twice about the flight from God. Now, to say that atheism was integral to the worst crimes in history is not to say that individual atheists are prone to criminality, or conversely, that religious believers are good people. That's not what's being claimed here. Counterfactuals abound. But it is to say that the reasons for one's attraction to atheism, like the reasons for one's aversion to religious faith, might require more introspection than they're usually given. Excuse me. So let's look at a second cause to consider darkening the doorstep of a house of worship. I've never seen this argument made before, so I hope you like it. It has to do with a word that everybody likes to use and nobody likes to practice. The word is humility. This brings us to a Burkean point. Unless you are certain that you're smarter than everyone who came before you, all those generations reaching back through time that now culminate in your unique person, you must pause to wonder about the collective wisdom embedded in religion. After all, our secularizing world is anomalous in human history. Until very, very recently, as is still the case across most of the planet, human beings have practiced some form of religious observance. Whether we like it or not, Homo sapiens appear to be theotropic entities, inclined towards some form of belief in God or gods. Once again, it's only within the past few decades that this unspoken consensus has come apart in some places. This raises a question. Is there really no truth, no wisdom, no hidden treasures in the holy books and rituals that came before? This question, too, puts a decision before today's people. To my own detriment, I am not a particularly pious Christian, but I must admit the weight of that question, the weight of the idea that the buck stops here religiously, did push me in the direction of observance. I simply couldn't accept that buck passed down by all my ancestors, often in moments of great difficulty, could just stop with me. That centuries of spiritual capital were mine and mine alone to squander, or that I was free to reject with impunity something that many people before me had cultivated at what had to be considerable costs. Now, you might answer, as the new atheists would have answered, that all those ancestors, like everybody else's, were captives of some bizarre hoax, a continuing grand superstition run amok and perpetrated on humanity and accepted by humanity for reasons unknown. But can we really contemplate the specters of all those progenitors, yours and mine, and say with conviction that we, the living, know better than they did about answers to those inescapable questions? How are we to live, and how are we to die? Personally, I am skeptical that the short life of any individual offers time enough to map thorough answers to those questions. And if we want to know instead what some of the greatest minds in history has had to say about them, it is worth realizing this fact, we will find intellectual giants like Augustine, Aquinas, Boethius, Maimonides, and many, many more in the same place, namely on their knees. A third argument for entertaining religion has to do with a particular strength among today's young people, one that I think is mostly unnoticed. That is the unique critical sensibility conferred on them as digital natives, the generations first born into the internet age. Now, as consumers and processors of vast and unprecedented amounts of information, these digital natives are, in one sense, the least gullible generation in history. And you can test this if you have to ask somebody who's in their 20s or 30s whether the email you just got is a phishing kind. They know. They sort through the flotsam and jetsam of the internet at speeds that their parents cannot imagine. That is to say, they know not to trust everything they read at face value. And this gives them a head start in understanding that some conventional wisdom is suspect. And that head start might just make them more open to arguments than their parents' and grandparents' generations were on this critical point. The so-called liberations of the 1960s onward were built on lies. This is nowhere more true than of the body of works invoked to rationalize the 1960s most far-reaching social change, the sexual revolution. That revolution, as we know today, thanks to generations of corrective scholarship, was born and nurtured by falsehoods. So, for example, anthropologist Margaret Mead, whose work among Samoan adolescents was widely believed to prove that sexuality shouldn't be subject to rules, turned out to have cooked her books. And I have footnotes on that if anyone would like them. Margaret Sanger, the revolution's patron saint, was a eugenicist who worked with African-American pastors, to keep the number of Black people down. This fact is now so well established that even Planned Parenthood of Greater New York felt compelled to remove Margaret Sanger's name from their clinic in Manhattan. Then there is Alfred C. Kinsey, a researcher whose supposedly scientific tabulations of American sexual behavior were touted as evidence that rules proscribing sex were hypocritical. We know now that Kinsey was a harasser of subordinates long before the Me Too phenomenon, and that he also built some of his fabled corpus with data created by sex offenders recounting what they had done to infants and children. And on the debunking goes. Now, what does the sexual revolution have to do with the case for theism? The answer is simple. Today's young people, especially, are more and more often victims of that same cultural change. They hail from a world characterized by one word, fewer. After the sexual revolution, there were fewer siblings. There were fewer family members. Thanks to widespread divorce and abortion, fewer is the word that characterizes people today. Gen Z is lonelier than any generation that came before. It is more prone to psychiatric trouble and addiction. But beyond those numbers, what we have to understand is that the people they represent, those individual young people, are obviously searching for love in a world where love has become harder to find. Organized religion, since the beginning, has placed rules around things like love and marriage and sex, because organized religion understands that these things have deep cosmic meanings. They connect human beings to eternity. Many of today's young people sense that all liberation all the time has not made them happier after all. That was the promise of the sexual revolution, and many of them know that to be false. That insight, born of hard experience, might just edge some of them toward religion's corner, not secularism's. Here's a fourth kind of argument that I've been able to use here at the Catholic Information Center and elsewhere to talk to younger people about the case for God. This has to do with the human patrimony. Ask yourself, or ask the nuns in your lives, why does everyone, religious or not, agree that Gothic cathedrals are among the most beautiful structures ever created? It's because architecture embodies ideas, and the idea of man and his relation to God and his place in the cosmos is incarnate in those cathedrals in a way that people somehow find commensurate with their experience. The space inside a Gothic cathedral feels true. And in focusing on Gothic cathedrals, I'm not picking on other ones. I'm just making the most obvious case here. And what goes for Gothic cathedrals goes for other sacred art as well. From the music of Palestrina to African American spirituals, music written with God as its object stands among the most precious creations of humanity. There is also the fact that Christianity in particular has transformed and stamped vast swaths of literature and the arts. The Western canon is unimaginable without Christianity. These creations, too, are among the most exquisite and sublime that have been bequeathed to us. Shakespeare, for example, cannot be understood apart from the Christian themes and Christian teachings that suffuse his plays and characters. The same is true of Gothic art, Renaissance painting and sculpture, most of philosophy, most of theology, and the rest. These facts do not change, including in an age when self-hating legatees of our civilization want to burn that same canon. There's a famous line from the Russian novelist Mikhail Bulgakov, who wrote my favorite book, a novel called The Master and Margarita. And in it, he speaks the immortal line, "Manuscripts don't burn," which has become a rallying cry around the world to mean that the suppression of truth does not suppress truth permanently. Similarly, the Western canon doesn't burn, even if some people would like it to. So this brings us to a question that is on the minds of many people, especially young people. And it concerns that phrase, well, why can't I be spiritual and not religious? Why can't I just do it myself? DIY spirituality. So I want to give you 3 reasons why DIY spirituality is not a viable alternative to organized faith. The first is a variant on the Burkean observation made earlier. Many of the most luminous souls of the past dedicated their earthly lives to living and working out the rules of the Talmud, the Catechism, and related texts. Was all of that really for nothing? I'd like to quote Irving Kristol here, a former boss of mine and a legendary intellectual, who was one of the most creative conservatives of the modern age. He once said, young people shouldn't have to invent new religions. The old religions are pretty good. There's actually a lot of depth in that observation. The second case to be made against a church of one's own or do-it-yourself spirituality has to do with something else, and that is the boundless human capacity for self-delusion. Let's say you're asked to design a menu for a dinner party, one that you will attend. What do you suppose will be on the menu? Well, from appetizers to dessert, they will surely line up with what it is you like to eat. If you're a vegetarian, for example, meat won't be the entree. If you do like seafood, crustaceans probably will be present. If you don't like red wine, then obviously your dinner will feature something white instead, and so on. The point of this homely example is that when we Homo sapiens are left to devise rules for ourselves, we inevitably concoct whatever is easiest and pleases us best. And the same is true of self-conceived religion or personal spirituality. In fact, it's probably true of that endeavor above all. So, for example, if I am a fan of poker, especially Texas Hold'em, as is true, you can be sure that my personal spirituality will not proscribe gambling. Or if my neighbor is devising her own spirituality and she's itching to leave her husband at the time, you can imagine her rules about marriage will be helpfully elastic. There's another quote to ponder in this context. It comes from Herman Melville's novella, Billy Budd. There's an antagonist named John Claggart who wantonly destroys the life of an innocent sailor for no reason other than envy. And what Melville says about that is that it's not that Claggart lacked a conscience. It's just that, quote, his conscience was a lawyer to his will. His conscience was a lawyer to his will. And that, I think, should be the epitaph on do-it-yourself religion. Given the robust human capacity for self-deceit, such subjective spiritualities will not test us, improve us, deepen us, or tell us to do things that are hard because they're good. Instead, they serve as de facto justifications for whatever it is that any individual among us wants to rationalize about our behavior. Now, in closing, to leave plenty of time for questions, let us grant that this might seem an unlikely moment to make the case for organized faith. Once upon a time, participation in organized religion and its good works enjoyed social cachet in this country. In some parts of America, it still does, but in other parts, that day has passed. Today, the public expression of faith is increasingly penalized by an ascendant secularism that sees religious belief as an adversary to be vanquished, rather than as a competing body of thought that might peacefully coexist in society. As well, to be devil's advocate, there are other reasons or professed reasons for disdaining religiosity these days. These include the sexual and financial scandals that have plagued some churches. But here, as elsewhere, human error and human fallenness does not invalidate truth. Or, as you can put it to a digital native, The fact that computers can be hacked only makes sound coding more important, not less important. It is true that religious faith comes with rules attached, including rules to which many people today furiously object. But millennials and Zoomers may yet turn out to be made of more rugged stuff than the snowflakes nickname suggests. And this brings us to a point about hope. As college students, these younger generations have been honed by the rigors of a sometimes punitive meritocracy. By virtue of their birthdays, whether they went to college or not, they've endured knocks that the boomers and Generation X never had to face when they were young. The anxious years following 9/11, the crash of 2008, social media bullying, education by Zoom, and a global pandemic. These trials must have left many people in their teens, 20s, and 30s longing for happier, deeper days, longing for a reality more congruent with energy and hope. And that fact, too, points to the possibility that they should entertain the thought of God. A long line of religious converts stretching back through millennia were propelled by nothing less than that same unbidden, often unspoken sense that one finds among the young these days, that they were made for better things than the world around them is supplying. As everyone knows, it was the young who were hardest hit by the pandemic and the lockdowns, which interrupted their social lives and their friendships at a critical point in development. In other words, they are even more aware than the rest of us of this one critical fact. A molecular confection about 1,000th the size of a human hair managed to upend just about every aspect of human society in 2020. All across the globe, the COVID-19 pandemic confronted humanity with a profound truth. Sometimes the most important reality in the world can be invisible to your eyes. And maybe the virus isn't the only such thing. In sum, religious traditionalists have been in a defensive crouch for some time now. There are social obstacles to professing belief these days: raised eyebrows, marginalizing, and the messages, tacit and overt, that the better sort just don't do God. But the fact that religion is now countercultural in much of the West is no reason for ruling it out. In fact, for young people looking for the real rebellion, that very countercultural fact might be enticing in itself, maybe even more important than reasoned arguments. So that's one final gambit to try as you make your way among your nuns. Thank you very much. Looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Mary. That was wonderful in so many ways. I knew it would be, and I just thinking through that, the organization of this, that, the four arguments being history, humility, digital natives, and just the human patrimony. It was such a clear way of organizing, and hopeful too. I think it's very easy for us to sit here and fret about things. And so I really very, very much appreciate what you've done today. And I really believe that these things, we can take this information and, as you say, speak to younger people through through your words, using your words and your arguments and your interest and faith. That is how we will spread the good news, really, and the hope. So thank you for that. Please, everyone out there, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A. I'll do my best to respond to those and ask Mary. Mary, I thought I would just start off with a couple of questions that I was personally interested in. In one of our Praxis Circle videos, and you alluded to this in your talk today, you mentioned the point about that there is common ground to find between younger generations and older generations. Could you speak a little bit to that, and maybe even the work that you've participated in, where this common ground is and how young people embrace it once they realize that there is common ground to be had?
So thank you, Mason. In a nutshell, I think the common ground is this. Older people want younger people to be happy. Younger people want younger people to be happy. And younger people, by and large, are miserable. I think the common ground starts with acknowledging the suffering out there. And of course, young people are about much more than suffering. But in my work, especially looking at contemporary sociology, it is inescapable that people who in their teens and 20s today have problems on an order that did not exist before. The rates of psychiatric trouble, which it is now agreed by therapists, are not just because we've become better at diagnosing these things. No, they're real. They're real rises in anxiety, depression, suicide, the worst kinds of things. There's a real rise in loneliness, which is partly because, of course, so many of us spend so much time on this, but also because of what I was talking about in the speech. There is a people deficit out there. There's a deficit of aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews. There are people who live to middle age these days without ever holding a baby. And anyone who's held a baby or been around babies knows how much joy babies and toddlers and children bring. We have to understand that these are joys that many of today's young people don't experience. So on a very practical level, when I talk to people who are secular, or when I talk to people on campuses who have no idea of the direction that some of us are coming from, I start with that. I ask about what is the dating scene like on campus? Are you meeting people? Are people meeting people? Are people happy? And invariably, unless it's a religious campus, invariably the answer is no. There's just a lot of misery out there. I'll speak very frankly about it. Some of it has to do with the fact that the girls know that a lot of the boys, a majority of the boys, are watching pornography. They don't like that. That's a huge obstacle to human relationships. And so I kind of start with this sort of brokenness and then ask people, well, what would it take to make you happier? Because there are other ways of living. There are things outside the hookup culture. There are things outside just taking for granted that this is the way we live now. And those are not the easiest conversations, but I do think that they're a start.
You going to one of the subtitle of Primal Screams, that identity politics, sexual revolution. There's one question here, which I think is very interesting. Do you think transgenderism is a product of so many nones? N-O-N-E-S.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question. Let me think about that for a minute. I think given what we human beings have done to ourselves by embracing the sexual revolution, by ceasing to exist in families, by losing extended networks of people who have our backs, extended family, I think there's been a collapse in social learning. And what I mean is there's been a collapse in human knowledge about other people. Like if you have 6 brothers and 4 sisters, you learn about boys and girls just by dint of being in a situation where you have a lot of people to study. We know this from animal science. Animals learn by watching other animals, typically their parents. A monkey isn't born knowing how to be a monkey. A monkey learns what monkeys do. That's the saying, right? Monkey see, monkey do. It's true. There's a lot of interesting animal science about this. So my point is this: in the matter of transgenderism, the wonder isn't that people are that confused. It would be a wonder if people weren't, because they lack the social knowledge of other human beings that all the generations before us took for granted. That's my take.
Another question, I back to the literary, which I tend to focus on personally. And Billy Budd, I haven't read that book in many years, but the Claggart character, and if I'm correct, I think the captain was named Veer, which is a derivative of truth. Veer, I think. I could be wrong, so everyone in the Q&A may call me out on that. But I wanted to go back to this quotation about that Claggart abuses Billy Budd because his conscience was a lawyer to his will. And then also in the Solzhenitsyn essay that we read, there's a quotation in there where he says, "Revolution must begin with atheism." So I'm wondering where this sense of conscience and being a lawyer to the will and how it relates to atheism, or these movements that seem like they're revolutions around us. Like, how do we, as believers or as people of faith, how do we counteract the person who's got the conscience as the lawyer to the will? What do we do?
That's a great question. I think we start with the problem of evil. And this, I find, is another effective way of bringing these issues up. I mentioned the example of Auschwitz. Well, one can think of many other examples, including some right in our world at this very moment. When people say they don't believe in God, they're saying that they don't believe in the independent existence of good. But I suspect that many people do believe in the independent existence of evil. The Claggart character you mentioned is evil. And I also haven't read Billy Budd in a long time, so I can't speak to any of the other particulars except that phrase, his conscience was a lawyer to his will, which I think is very important. But if people grant that there is such a thing as evil, that there is such a thing as some independent existence of malignity, I think those people are most of the way down the road toward church. They just don't know it yet. And so focusing on that may be a way of getting at this.
I see. One of our participants has listed, I'm just going to read it out because I think this is an interesting a very good suggestion. What about a list or a resource for those who are organized, faith-based, to come and lure children and other adults, at least open their thoughts and minds to a further endeavor? Maybe, just maybe, this is an interesting and worthwhile investigation. There has to be a way to redirect and wake people up, something easy enough, lure adults into trying something. I find in my interactions that this is a wonderful suggestion, this idea of conversation. But even within my own communities of faith or where I participate, I find like even some of these conversations are just like almost non-starters, like the identity politics one. It's almost like before you even start, it's like, well, what are your pronouns, or what are this or that? Like and I'm not here to debate that as a function of what people are doing. I'm just trying to understand how to reach through to people. Where are the places where we can have these conversations in meaningful ways? In your work, how are the programs set up to bring out this suggestion where we can bring people together to say, look at what is really happening, or let's talk about it? Where are those places?
So I have two kinds of answers to that. One is, for example, the Catholic Information Center, where I'm speaking to you from. Obviously it's Catholic. Obviously it does things like Mass and the sacraments and stuff, but it also brings in people. One of my closest friends is Jewish, and he used to come here all the time because of the lectures, the quality of the bookstore, the quality of people coming in and talking, usually, but not always, from a Catholic direction. So in other words, part of what makes this place work is that young people know they will find other young professionals here, and that it's a combination of socializing and some intellectual stuff, and that everybody is welcome. And I've met extraordinary people through this place, including a lot of young converts. And I think if this experiment could be replicated as a house of studies that does things like have a wine and cheese night and also have a lecture every other week by some author passing through town and socializing afterwards. If we saw more of that, I think we'd be in a better place, because again, going to the point about what young people want, they don't really want, any more than any other human being wants, to sit alone with their smartphone all day long. They want to meet people. They want to have friends. And very often they're coming out of families with very little gravitational pull. So I feel as if we could speak to the social need there with more creative experiments like this one here at the CIC. So that's one kind of answer. But there's another kind of answer that goes beyond intellectual stuff. A few years ago, I was on a secular campus, and a young woman came up at the end of my talk, and she said, I want to tell you something. I'm a Christian convert. And I said, oh, wow. I didn't know why she was telling me this. She said, well, I have to tell you my story. And I said, okay, what did it? Was it the music? Was it the theology? Was it, I rattled off a lot of abstract things that I have known to work on other people. She said, no. She said it was this. I was an only child of a single mother, and my best friend in high school came from a big Christian family. And at first it was really exotic to me and kind of shocking. But as time went on, I spent more and more time at their house. And finally, I realized I want what they have. I want what they have. it's a story I'm never going to forget because it summarizes so much of what I'm trying to do in my work. And I think she said it better. In other words, people want the same things. And the problem with the young today is that they're having a harder time finding them, I think, than anyone else has had. So in addition to the intellectual arguments, just the power of example, just the power, and I don't mean moral example. I don't mean like set yourself up as a moral paragon. No, none of us are that. I do mean be aware that the joy with which you talk about this stuff also makes an impression, as does just the sheer power of example of family and community and doing good works.
So here's a question that's related, but it's actually on the other side of this argument. And it's, how can we approach this general topic with nuns who are actually quite content without thinking about or interacting with God? Those that are living life with apparent joy and not the depression and anxiety that is more common amongst this group.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And it gets back, I think, to the idea of good works. People might think that it's chill, right? It's just chill. It's fine to be the way they are, without God, without community. But I don't believe that's true because we are social creatures. And one challenge to people like that is, do you believe there are things that make you a better person? Do you think volunteering in a soup kitchen makes you a better person? Do you think that doing other kinds of good works, visiting people in hospitals, or if you're a singer, singing in old age homes, or whatever it might be, do you think those are good things? Because those are things that religious people do. And I'm not saying non-religious people never do them, but just as non-religious people tend not to have families or to have very small families, non-religious people also don't have the kind of communities that tell them to do those things because those are good things to do. They make you a better person. And so maybe one way to approach this with the nuns who say, I'm perfectly fine the way I am, is to invite them along to some event where you're doing that kind of thing, whatever it may be, helping the less fortunate in some way, and showing them by example that there is something good about doing good, and that religion is the home for understanding that.
Yeah. Yes. And in your talk, your second point was about humility, and that, this concept of being inclined to belief through something more powerful or bigger. We have a question here that hints back at this, sort of tacks another way, and it's less about the nuns, and it's more about the communities of faith. And so the question says, what are churchgoers doing? How are we behaving in a way that attracts nuns? Or put another way, what are nuns seeing in us that is either drawing them towards the church or not? And so could you speak a little bit about that?
I think one major reason that a lot of them reject church is, as I said, church puts rules around certain things, including things that young people especially have a hard time with and don't want to have rules about, namely sex. And so, that's just probably an issue in every generation. On the other hand, I find it's possible to make headway about that by talking about discipline. because we live in an age when some people are super fit, and many people, especially young people, are very careful about what they eat, so on. And so it seems kind of weird that sex should be the only thing that's off limits for discussion about limits. That's one thought about that. I mean, what do they see in us? To give another answer, of course, the sex scandals in the Catholic Church, particularly, which I mentioned earlier, and financial scandals in Catholic Church and other churches, obviously all of that is no help, to say the least. It's deplorable. On the other hand, honestly, I think those kinds of proofs of human fallenness, when correctly understood, point to the fact that something out there doesn't want these churches to exist. Something out there gets into them and makes people do bad things or helps them do bad things. And I think, again, getting back to a language about evil is something people understand, especially young people. There's a reason why they flock to these movies, right? About exorcism and horror movies and this kind of stuff, because these movies speak to their innate sense that there is evil in the world and they don't have any other language for understanding it. So this is another example of common ground between the people in the churches and the people outside the churches.
Right. That's an interesting example. You said that, and I was reminded that one of my students long ago, she was a super put together person. I mean, everything was just super highly organized. She was motivated. She didn't get in trouble. And she was from a good family, and I don't know what her religious convictions were, but she loved these horror movies. I mean, and it was so different from her persona. I mean, it just seemed, and I remember asking her, like, why are you interested in these things? And I don't remember what her answer was, but I think there was something in her that was like, it was very appealing because it was so different from her life, which is, or the life that she was living, which was just so regimented. So there was this appeal to this evil side, or a depiction of evil, so to speak, not her personally. Which gets me to the last question we have time for, and this is a complicated one. But do we need to bring God back into schools? And this is from one of our participants. And I would just add, so the question is, do we need to bring God back into schools? And the question is, if so, how could we do that?
So about God in schools, I think it's already happening. Just today, I believe in the Washington Post, there was some story about the explosion in homeschooling. And part of the reason for that explosion, we know well, is that people are increasingly afraid. Parents are increasingly afraid about what is being taught to their children, especially in public schools where there's so much less accountability. So there's the explosion of homeschooling. There's also the rapid development of classical academies, that is K through 8 education that teaches Greek and Latin and memorization and sacred music and all of that. In other words, it seems like more and more parents are finding a way to do an end run around the problem that God is not in school anymore, not in public school. It does unfortunately mean there are a lot of kids trapped in those schools who are not going to hear about these things in school, which makes it, I think, all the more necessary that we try to reach out where we can, just to the people in our lives, about all these things. And to close on what I think is a hopeful note, what you were saying about your student made me think again about transgression. young people like transgression, and it can be good or it can be bad. But in the situation we are in with secularization, I think transgression puts wind in the sails of the religious and religious institutions, and not in the sails of secularisms. So that's a whole nother way of talking about this with younger people, is to point out that this religious faith is now the countercultural choice.
Right. That's a great point. Very hopeful. And I agree with you that, young people wanting that kind of countercultural feeling or vibe or participating, that it certainly does seem like a rich field to try to explore with them. Mary, once again, thank you so much for your insight, your expertise, your faith, your sharing your time and talents with us. I feel coming out of this, hopeful about future conversations I have with young people, including two that are very close to me, in fact. I would like for all of you participating today that we at Praxis Circle plan to continue this discussion of why God in small groups. So please look out for email communication from us in the coming weeks about that. Our next webinar series will be December 6th with Dr. Ann Bradley, who's an economist, who will discuss the Christian economic model. And in the meantime, we at Praxis Circle extend to you our very best. And please visit our website, www.praxiscircle.com, where you can find resources, blog posts, and interviews dedicated to building your worldview. Thank you all for participating today. Thank you again, Mary. We will see you all very soon.
Thank you, Mason.